My daughter Sarah's face drained of all color as she realized that the embarrassing old woman she'd banned from her wedding had just walked down the aisle arm in arm with her new mother-in-law, and that the woman she'd dismissed as too dramatic and attention-seeking had just been revealed as the secret benefactor who paid for the entire $75,000 wedding she thought her fiancé's family had funded. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something even more shocking to share about what happened during the reception. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by certified mail as if it were a legal document rather than a celebration announcement. The heavy cream envelope was addressed in Sarah's careful calligraphy to Mrs. Eleanor Walsh Guest, as if I were some distant family acquaintance rather than the mother of the bride who had spent the last 8 months excitedly planning for this day. But it was the handwritten note paperclipped to the corner of the invitation that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Mom, after much consideration and several difficult conversations, David and I have made the incredibly hard decision that your presence at our wedding would create unnecessary drama and stress on what should be the happiest day of our lives. We know this will hurt you, but we need to prioritize our peace of mind and the comfort of our other guests. We hope you can find it in your heart to respect our decision and wish us well from afar. This isn't about punishment. It's about protecting our joy. Love, Sarah. I read the note 3 times, each pass making the words more surreal rather than more comprehensible. The letters seemed to rearrange themselves on the page, as if my brain was refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. After 32 years of raising Sarah Michelle Walsh, after supporting her through college, her first heartbreak, her career struggles, her apartment searches, her relationship dramas, and 8 months of enthusiastic wedding planning, after being her closest confidant, biggest cheerleader, and most generous supporter for 3 decades, I was being uninvited from her wedding because my presence would create drama. Standing in my sun-filled kitchen in the Pearl District of Portland, Oregon, holding an invitation to an event I was simultaneously invited to and banned from, I felt the peculiar disorientation of having reality shift beneath my feet. The familiar weight of my coffee mug in my hands, the morning light streaming through windows I'd chosen and hung curtains for, the sound of traffic on the street below. Everything felt normal except for the fact that my daughter had just informed me that celebrating her marriage would be improved by my absence. At 70 years old, I thought I understood my place in my daughter's life. I thought I knew the contours of our relationship, the boundaries of our love, the unshakable foundation of the bond we'd built over more than 3 decades together. Apparently, I had been catastrophically wrong. The invitation itself was beautiful. Thick, cardstock with elegant letterpress printing, exactly the kind of sophisticated design Sarah had always admired. Sarah Michelle Walsh and David Jonathan Chen request the honor of your presence. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were requesting the honor of my presence, while simultaneously informing me that my presence would dishonor their celebration. Set the invitation on my granite countertop and stared at it as if it might suddenly reveal itself to be an elaborate joke, a misunderstanding, anything other than what it clearly was. My daughter's formal declaration that I was no longer welcome at the most important moment of her adult life. The backstory that led to this moment had been building for 8 months, ever since that excited phone call in July when Sarah announced her engagement to David Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer whose quiet demeanor and traditional values had initially seemed like the perfect complement to my daughter's more vibrant personality. "Mom, we're engaged!" she'd squealed over the phone, her voice bubbling with the kind of pure joy I hadn't heard since she was a child opening presents on Christmas morning. David proposed last night at the Japanese garden, and it was absolutely perfect. We're thinking about a spring wedding, maybe April or May, something elegant but not too big. I'd been over the moon. After watching Sarah navigate a series of relationships that seemed to drain her energy rather than replenish it, seeing her with David had been like watching her come home to herself. He was steady where she was mercurial, thoughtful where she was impulsive, grounding where she tended to soar. They seemed to balance each other in ways that promised a lifetime of mutual support and growth. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so happy for you," I'd gushed, already mentally scrolling through venue options and vendor recommendations. "We need to celebrate. When can I take you and David out for dinner? And we'll need to start thinking about engagement parties and dress shopping and—" "Mom," Sarah had laughed, "slow down. We just got engaged 12 hours ago. We haven't even told David's parents yet." But I couldn't slow down. My only daughter was getting married, and I was already imagining all the ways I could help make her wedding dreams come true. I started researching venues that same afternoon, creating spreadsheets of caterers and florists, bookmarking dress, designers and photographers. I wanted to be ready with options and suggestions when Sarah was ready to start planning. What I hadn't anticipated was how David's family, particularly his mother, Linda Chen, would become the measuring stick against which Sarah would judge every aspect of our own family dynamic. And according to that measurement, I had been found severely wanting in every possible way. Linda Chen was everything Sarah apparently wished I could be. Soft-spoken where I was enthusiastic, deferential where I was involved, quietly supportive where I was actively helpful. At 68, Linda had spent her 40 years of marriage perfecting what Sarah would later describe as appropriate boundaries between mother and adult children. Where I saw an engagement as an opportunity to share excitement and offer assistance, Linda apparently saw it as a moment to step back and allow the couple complete autonomy over their celebration. Where I researched venues and made suggestions, Linda waited to be asked for opinions and then offered them quietly, with careful disclaimers about respecting whatever decision the couple ultimately made. Where I offered financial support to ensure Sarah could have her dream wedding regardless of budget constraints, Linda apparently made it clear that she and her husband would contribute what they could within their means, but would never presume to influence the couple's choices through financial leverage. I, on the other hand, had apparently committed the unforgivable sin of being excited about my only daughter's wedding. The first sign that my enthusiasm was being misinterpreted came 6 weeks after the engagement, when Sarah and I met for lunch at our usual spot, a cafe in the Alberta Arts District, where we'd been having mother-daughter dates for over 10 years. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," Sarah had said after we'd ordered our usual grilled salmon for her, chicken Caesar salad for me, iced tea for both of us with extra lemon. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" "It's about the wedding planning. I know you're excited, and I love that you want to help, but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by all the suggestions and research you've been sending me." I'd been sending her options, not demands, links to beautiful venues, contact information for recommended photographers, articles about wedding trends she might find interesting. I thought I was being helpful, giving her a starting point for her own research rather than leaving her to figure everything out from scratch. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sorry if I sent too much information. I just wanted to make sure you knew about all your options. You don't have to use any of my suggestions. I just thought it might help to have a starting point." "I know, and I appreciate it really. It's just that David's family has a very different approach to these things. They're more hands-off. They trust us to make our own decisions without a lot of input. But honey, I'm not trying to make decisions for you. I'm just trying to share resources and ideas. You're still making all the choices." "I know that's what you think you're doing," Sarah had said carefully. "But sometimes it feels like you have very strong opinions about what I should choose, and it's hard to know if I'm making decisions because I actually want something or because I know it would make you happy." This had been genuinely confusing to me. In 32 years of parenting Sarah, I'd always tried to support her choices while offering guidance when she asked for it. When she was choosing colleges, I'd researched options and helped her think through the pros and cons, but the final decision had been entirely hers. When she was job hunting, I'd helped her practice interviews and review offers. But she'd chosen her career path based on her own interests and goals. Sarah, can you give me an example of when you felt like I was pressuring you toward a particular choice? I really want to understand what I'm doing that's making you feel this way. She'd hesitated, stirring her iced tea with more focus than the task required. Well, like when we were talking about venues last week. You sent me information about that country club in Lake Oswego, and you mentioned how beautiful their garden ceremonies are, and how much you've always loved that location. It made me feel like if I didn't choose that venue, I'd be disappointing you. Honey, I mentioned that I thought it was beautiful, but I also sent you information about 6 other venues that are completely different styles. I was trying to show you the range of options available, not steer you toward one particular choice. But you didn't talk about those other venues with the same excitement. I can tell when you really like something, Mom, and it makes me feel guilty if I don't like it too. This conversation had been my first indication that Sarah was interpreting my enthusiasm as pressure, my research as control, my excitement as an attempt to hijack her wedding for my own purposes. But I'd thought it was a communication issue that we could resolve by being more careful about how we discussed wedding plans. Okay, I understand. How would you like me to handle it when you ask for suggestions? Would you prefer that I just send you information without commentary? Or would you rather research everything yourself and ask me specific questions when you want input? Actually, Sarah had said, I think it might be better if we take a step back from the planning process altogether. David and I want to figure out what we want first, and then we can ask for help with specific things if we need it. I'd agreed, though it had felt like being asked to stop breathing. Wedding planning had been something I'd looked forward to since Sarah was a little girl playing dress-up in my bedroom, draping herself in scarves and declaring that she was a princess getting married in a castle. The idea of not being involved in creating her real wedding felt like being excluded from one of the most significant passages of her life. But I'd respected her request. I'd stopped sending venue information, stopped forwarding articles about wedding trends, stopped bringing up planning details unless she specifically asked. I'd thought I was demonstrating that I could respect her boundaries while still being available for support when she wanted it. What I hadn't realized was that stepping back hadn't been enough. According to Sarah's evolving perspective, the very fact that stepping back felt difficult for me was evidence that I was too invested in controlling her wedding experience. The second major warning sign came in November, when Sarah called to tell me about a conversation she'd had with Linda Chen about wedding planning philosophy. Mom, I had the most enlightening talk with David's mom yesterday, Sarah had said, her voice carrying an enthusiasm that I hadn't heard directed toward me in months. She was telling me about how she and David's dad approached their kids' major life decisions, and it's so different from how our family does things. Oh? How so? Well, she said that when David was choosing colleges, she and Mr. Chen never researched schools for him or tried to influence his choices. They just told him they were proud of him for working hard and that they trusted him to make the best decision for his future. And when his sister was planning her wedding 5 years ago, Linda said she waited to be asked for opinions and never offered suggestions unless specifically requested. That sounds very respectful, I'd said carefully, though I was already sensing where this conversation was heading. It is. And she said, the result is that their kids feel completely confident making independent decisions because they know their parents trust their judgment. They don't have to worry about disappointing anyone or managing other people's expectations. Sarah, do you feel like you can't make independent decisions? Do you feel like I don't trust your judgment? Not exactly, she'd said. But I do feel like you get very invested in the outcomes of my choices, which makes me worry about how you'll react if I choose something different from what you would prefer. Can you give me an example? Well, like when I was deciding whether to take the promotion at work last year. You were so excited about the opportunity and kept talking about how proud you were and how much the new position would advance my career. It made it really hard for me to think objectively about whether the job was actually right for me, because I knew how disappointed you'd be if I turned it down. This had been genuinely shocking to me. Sarah had been offered a promotion to senior marketing manager at her firm, with a significant salary increase and expanded responsibilities. She'd been working toward that kind of advancement for 3 years, and I'd been excited because she'd achieved a goal she'd set for herself. When she'd ultimately accepted the position, I'd assumed it was because she wanted the opportunity, not because she felt pressured by my enthusiasm. Sarah, I had no idea you felt that way. I was excited because you'd worked so hard for that kind of opportunity, and I thought you wanted it. If you felt pressured by my reaction, I'm so sorry. I never intended to influence your decision. I was just proud of your success. I know you didn't mean to pressure me, she'd said, but that's kind of the point. You get so emotionally invested in my choices that even when you're trying to be supportive, it feels like there's a lot riding on my decisions. Linda's approach is so much more freeing because her kids never have to worry about managing her emotions along with their own. That conversation had been a turning point in our relationship, though I hadn't fully understood it at the time. Sarah had begun comparing every aspect of our family dynamic to the Chen family model, and according to her assessment, we came up short in every area that mattered. Where I was enthusiastic, Linda was appropriately restrained. Where I was involved, Linda was respectfully distant. Where I offered support and resources, Linda waited to be asked and then provided minimal assistance to avoid overstepping boundaries. The irony was that I'd spent 32 years trying to be the kind of mother I'd wished I'd had, someone who was actively interested in my life, enthusiastic about my achievements, and generous with both emotional and practical support. My own mother had been loving but distant, supportive but uninvolved, present but not particularly engaged with the details of my daily life. I'd promised myself that when I became a mother, I would be different. I would be the parent who showed up for school plays and science fairs, who remembered the names of my daughter's friends and teachers, who took an active interest in her hobbies and goals and dreams. I would be enthusiastic about her successes, helpful during her challenges, and generous with both my time and resources when she needed support. But according to Sarah's new perspective, all of those qualities that I'd thought made me a good mother were actually evidence that I was too emotionally enmeshed in her life, too invested in outcomes I couldn't control, too eager to help in ways that undermined her independence. The final straw, according to the letter that would arrive 2 weeks before the wedding invitation, came in January when Sarah and David announced that they'd decided to have a small, intimate ceremony with only immediate family and a few close friends. "Mom, we've been thinking a lot about what kind of wedding would feel most meaningful to us," Sarah had said during what I hadn't known would be our last normal conversation. "And we've decided we want something really simple and intimate. Just our parents, our siblings, and maybe 10 or 15 close friends. Something that feels more like a family celebration than a big production." "That sounds lovely, sweetheart," I'd replied honestly. "There's something really special about intimate weddings. You can focus on what matters most without getting overwhelmed by logistics." Exactly. We want the day to be about our commitment to each other and the people who matter most to us, not about putting on a show or managing a big event. I think that's a beautiful approach. Have you started thinking about venues that would work well for a smaller group? We're actually thinking about having it at David's parents' house. They have a really beautiful backyard, and Linda offered to let us use it if we want something intimate and meaningful. That sounds perfect. There's something so special about celebrating in a place that has personal significance. We're really excited about it. The only thing we're worried about is budget. Even a small wedding can be expensive when you want everything to be really nice, and we're trying to be realistic about what we can afford on our salaries. And that's when I'd made what Sarah would later describe as the fatal error that proved I was incapable of respecting their autonomy. "Well, sweetheart, you know that budget doesn't have to be a limiting factor if you don't want it to be. Your father and I always planned to help with your wedding expenses, And if having everything exactly the way you want it requires a little more financial support, I'd be more than happy to make sure that happens. The silence on the other end of the phone had been long enough that I'd wondered if the call had dropped. Sarah? Are you still there? I'm here, Mom. I'm just processing what you just said. Is something wrong? I was just letting you know that you don't have to compromise on your vision because of budget constraints. I want you to have exactly the wedding you're dreaming of. But Mom, we just told you we want a simple, intimate celebration. We're not dreaming of some expensive extravaganza that we can't afford. We're dreaming of something meaningful that reflects our values and priorities. Of course, and I think that's wonderful. I'm not suggesting you should have an expensive extravaganza. I'm just saying that if your simple, intimate celebration requires vendors or elements that strain your budget, I don't want money to be the reason you can't have exactly what you want. But don't you see how that changes everything? Sarah had asked, her voice rising with frustration. The minute you offer to pay for things, our decisions stop being about what we actually want and start being about what we think is appropriate to accept. It puts pressure on us to either limit ourselves to what we can afford, which makes us feel guilty for not accepting your generosity, or to accept your help, which makes us feel like we're not independent adults capable of funding our own wedding. This had been genuinely confusing to me. Sarah, I'm not trying to pressure you either way. I'm just letting you know that financial support is available if you want it and not available if you don't. You get to choose what feels right for you. But Mom, the fact that you're offering it all means you have opinions about what our wedding should be like. If you thought our budget constraints were perfectly reasonable, you wouldn't be offering to eliminate them. That's not true at all. I offered because I want you to have choices, not because I think your current choices are inadequate. I need to go, Sarah had said abruptly. David's here, and we need to talk about this. The conversation had ended, without resolution, and I'd spent the following days wondering what I'd said that had been so problematic. I'd been offering support, not demanding control. I'd been trying to remove obstacles, not create expectations. I'd been expressing love through generosity, not manipulation through financial leverage. But apparently, that distinction had been lost on Sarah. The letter that arrived a week later had spelled out my transgressions in painful, devastating detail. Mom, we've had several long conversations about the wedding planning process and our family dynamics, and we've realized that we need to establish some clearer boundaries to protect our relationship and our mental health during this important time in our lives. We appreciate your enthusiasm about our wedding, but we've come to understand that your way of showing support often feels overwhelming and controlling to us. When we share our decisions with you, we don't want research and suggestions. We want celebration and acceptance. When we mention challenges, we don't want solutions and offers of help. We want empathy and confidence in our ability to handle our own problems. David's family has shown us what it looks like to be supportive without being invasive, helpful without being controlling, and generous without creating obligation. Linda has never once offered unsolicited advice, questioned our decisions, or tried to solve problems we didn't ask for help with. She trusts us to be capable adults, and that trust feels like the most loving gift she could give us. We know you love us and want the best for us, but we've realized that your way of expressing love requires us to manage your emotions along with our own. We end up spending as much energy worrying about your reactions to our choices as we do, making the choices themselves, and that's not healthy for any of us. We need space to plan our wedding and start our marriage without feeling like we have to justify our decisions or manage anyone else's expectations. We hope you can understand that this isn't about rejecting your love. It's about protecting our autonomy and peace of mind during one of the most important transitions of our lives. The letter had felt like a physical blow. After 32 years of what I'd thought was loving, supportive parenting, my daughter was essentially telling me that my love felt like a burden rather than a gift, that my support felt like control. rather than assistance, that my presence in her life required emotional labor that she was no longer willing to provide. But the wedding invitation with its attached note had been the final verdict. Not only was my approach to loving my daughter problematic, but my very presence at her wedding would be a threat to her happiness. Sitting in my kitchen, holding that invitation, I felt the weight of a revelation that changed everything I thought I understood about my life. The relationship I'd treasured most in the world, the bond I'd thought was unshakable, the love I'd believed was reciprocal and appreciated. All of it had been built on foundations that were apparently far more fragile than I'd ever imagined. My daughter didn't want my enthusiasm. She wanted my distance. She didn't want my support. She wanted my absence. She didn't want my love as I knew how to give it. She wanted a completely different kind of mother, one who looked suspiciously like Linda Chen. At 70 years old, I was learning that everything I'd believed about being a good mother had been wrong. That everything I'd thought made me valuable in my daughter's life actually made me a problem to be managed. That the woman who had raised Sarah, supported her, and loved her unconditionally for 3 decades was now considered too dramatic, too overwhelming, and too controlling to be trusted at her wedding. The invitation sat on my counter like evidence of my failure as a mother. Sarah had made her choice, and she'd chosen Linda Chen's quiet, deferential love over Eleanor Walsh's enthusiastic, generous affection. But what Sarah didn't know, what she had never bothered to discover in all her years of taking my support for granted, was that the mother she'd dismissed as overwhelming and dramatic was about to demonstrate exactly how much power she'd been underestimating. The woman she'd decided was too controlling to include in her wedding was about to become the woman whose exclusion would create far more drama than her presence ever could have. And the mother she thought she could simply uninvite was about to teach her a lesson about the consequences of underestimating Eleanor Walsh when she stopped seeking approval and started taking action. The wedding was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks for me to figure out how to live with the knowledge that my only daughter preferred to celebrate the most important day of her life without me, rather than risk the possibility that my love might somehow diminish her joy. But as I sat there in my sun-filled kitchen, staring at an invitation to an event I wasn't allowed to attend, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. Not the devastation I should have felt, not the resigned acceptance Sarah probably expected, not the grateful understanding she'd hoped for. I felt anger. Clean, focused, empowering anger. And underneath that anger, something even more powerful. Determination. The woman my daughter had dismissed was about to become the woman whose absence would be impossible to ignore. The mother she'd thought she could simply exclude was about to demonstrate that Eleanor Walsh didn't disappear just because someone decided she was inconvenient, and the wedding she thought she'd protected by banning me was about to become the stage for the most spectacular lesson in consequences Sarah had ever received. The invitation sat on my counter like a challenge. Sarah thought she'd solved her problem by excluding me from her special day. She was about to learn that she'd only created a much bigger problem by underestimating exactly what her mother was capable of when she stopped trying to earn approval and started taking control. And it was going to be magnificent. What Sarah didn't know as she celebrated her successful boundary setting with David that evening was that the mother she had just banished from her wedding was sitting on resources and connections that could have funded 10 weddings of the scale she was planning, and that the woman she'd dismissed as too dramatic and overwhelming had spent the last 15 years building a network of influence that extended far beyond anything her daughter had ever imagined. While Sarah saw me as a retired widow whose main occupation was being overly invested in her daughter's life, the reality was that Eleanor Walsh had been quietly building and managing what had become one of the most successful event planning and luxury consulting businesses in the Pacific Northwest. Walsh Events and Design wasn't just a hobby I'd picked up to fill my time after my husband Richard died 5 years ago. It was a multi-million-dollar enterprise that had orchestrated weddings, corporate events, and private celebrations for everyone. From tech executives to Hollywood celebrities who wanted their Pacific Northwest events handled with absolute discretion and flawless execution. But here's the thing about being underestimated by your own family. You learn to keep your professional achievements and financial success private, because every time you've tried to share your accomplishments in the past, they've found ways to diminish them or suggest that your success is somehow inappropriate for someone your age. When I'd mentioned to Sarah 3 years ago that my event planning business had been featured in Portland Monthly as one of the top luxury service providers in Oregon, her response had been, "That's nice, Mom, but are you sure you're not taking on too much?" Event planning can be really stressful, and at your age, you should be focusing on relaxing and enjoying retirement. When I'd told her that I'd been hired to plan a destination wedding in Napa Valley for a Fortune 500 CEO's daughter, with a budget that exceeded most people's annual salaries, she'd said, "Mom, you need to be careful about clients who might have unrealistic expectations. Sometimes wealthy people can be really demanding, and I don't want you to get overwhelmed trying to please difficult customers." Every professional success had been met with concerns about my stress levels, warnings about potential problems, or suggestions that I should scale back and not overcommit myself at my age. So, I'd learned to keep my business achievements to myself while my daughter continued to see me as a well-meaning retiree whose biggest challenge was figuring out how to fill her days productively. The financial reality was even more impressive than my professional success. Richard's life insurance had paid out $800,000 when he died. The sale of his architectural firm had brought another $1.2 million. Our house in the Pearl District, which we'd bought in 1995 for $180,000, was now worth $1.4 million. Our investment portfolio, which Richard had been building systematically for 35 years, was worth another $2.3 million. But Walsh Events and Design had been generating its own substantial revenue stream that had surprised even me. What had started as a way to channel my grief into something productive had evolved into a business that regularly brought in $400,000 to $600,000 annually, depending on the scale and number of events I chose to take on. My client list included the governor's chief of staff, whose daughter's wedding I'd planned at a historic estate in the Columbia River Gorge, the founder of 3 successful tech startups, whose corporate retreats I'd been orchestrating for 2 years running, a famous actress whose Pacific Northwest home I'd helped design and whose private events I managed with ironclad confidentiality agreements. These weren't random clients who had stumbled across my services through word-of-mouth referrals. They were sophisticated, wealthy individuals who had sought me out specifically because of my reputation for creating extraordinary experiences that exceeded expectations while maintaining absolute discretion and professionalism. But Sarah had no idea that her mother commanded this level of professional respect or financial independence. In her mind, I was still the grieving widow she'd helped set up online banking 5 years ago, someone who needed guidance with technology and might benefit from structured activities to keep from getting lonely. The gap between her perception and my reality had become a source of quiet amusement for me over the past few years. While she worried about my social isolation, I was having dinner with clients who had become friends, attending industry events where my work was recognized and celebrated, and collaborating with other luxury service providers who valued my expertise and sought out my partnership on high-profile projects. While she fretted about my limited income on my fixed retirement budget, I was turning down projects because my calendar was already booked with events that paid more than she made in 6 months at her marketing job. While she assumed I needed her guidance to make major decisions, I was running a business that required me to make complex judgment calls every day about million-dollar budgets, celebrity privacy requirements, and logistical challenges that would overwhelm most professional event planners. The woman sitting in that kitchen, staring at a wedding invitation she wasn't allowed to use, wasn't someone who had been reduced to accepting charity from her ungrateful daughter. She was someone who had been quietly building an empire while being systematically underestimated by the person whose opinion mattered most to her. and Sarah had just handed me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what she'd been missing. Because here's what my daughter didn't understand about luxury event planning. It's not just about having good taste and organizational skills. It's about having access to vendors who are booked years in advance, relationships with venues that don't advertise their availability to the general public, and connections with service providers who will move mountains to accommodate last-minute requests because they know that working with Eleanor Walsh means working with someone who pays top dollar and generates referrals to other high-value clients. More importantly, it's about understanding that the most spectacular events are often the ones that appear to happen effortlessly, where every detail has been anticipated and every contingency has been planned for, where guests leave talking about the experience rather than the logistics. Sarah thought she was planning an intimate backyard wedding that would be simple and meaningful. What she didn't realize was that creating a truly memorable celebration, even a small one, required exactly the kind of expertise, vendor relationships, and financial resources that I had been accumulating for the past 15 years. And what she definitely didn't realize was that her future mother-in-law, Linda Chen, was about to become the most important ally I'd ever had in demonstrating just how spectacularly wrong Sarah had been about everything. The first call I made after reading Sarah's wedding ban was to my assistant, Maria Rodriguez, who had been helping me manage Walsh events and design for the past 3 years. Maria was 34, bilingual, and had an MBA from Portland State University. She'd started working for me part-time while finishing her degree, and had become so indispensable that I'd offered her a full-time position with a salary that exceeded what most event planning companies paid their senior managers. "Maria, I need you to clear my calendar for the next 6 weeks," I said without preamble when she answered her phone. "We're taking on a special project that's going to require all of our attention and resources." "Of course, Mrs. Walsh. Should I reschedule the Morrison anniversary party and the Peterson corporate retreat? Reschedule everything that can be moved and refer everything else to Jennifer Kim at Cascade Events. Tell her I'll make it up to her with referrals later this year." This sounds serious. What's the project? "I'm going to plan the most spectacular wedding celebration that Portland has ever seen, and I'm going to do it in 6 weeks, and the bride doesn't know it's happening." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Walsh, that sounds like an episode of a reality TV show. Are you sure this is a good idea?" "Maria, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And when this is over, we're going to have a case study in luxury event planning that will be talked about in the industry for years." The second call I made was to Linda Chen. I'd met Linda exactly twice, once at Sarah and David's engagement party, and once at a casual dinner where the two families had gotten together to discuss wedding plans. Both times I'd been struck by how gracious and thoughtful she was, how carefully she listened before speaking, and how genuinely she seemed to care about David and Sarah's happiness. What I'd also noticed was how uncomfortable she seemed with Sarah's constant comparisons between our family styles, and how diplomatically she'd redirected conversations when Sarah started explaining why the Chen family's approach to boundaries was superior to the Walsh family's approach to involvement. Linda Chen wasn't trying to compete with me for the title of better mother-in-law. She was simply being herself, a woman who had raised her children with love and respect and who wanted to welcome Sarah into her family without creating conflict or comparison. But Sarah's need to position Linda as the good mother and me as the problematic mother had put Linda in an impossible situation where being herself had somehow become a judgment against me. I had a feeling that Linda was as uncomfortable with this dynamic as I was, and that she might be open to a conversation about how we could work together to give David and Sarah the wedding celebration they deserved, regardless of what Sarah thought she wanted. "Mrs. Chen, this is Eleanor Walsh. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Eleanor, please, call me Linda." "Of course it's not a bad time. How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, thank you." "Linda, I'm calling because I received some rather surprising News about Sarah and David's wedding, and I'm hoping we might be able to have a conversation about it. Oh dear. What kind of news? Sarah has decided that my presence at the wedding would create unnecessary drama, so she's asked me not to attend the ceremony. I'm sure this puts you in an awkward position, and I want you to know that I don't expect you to get involved in our family conflict. The silence on Linda's end was long enough that I wondered if I'd overstepped by sharing family business that she might prefer not to know about. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Sarah was considering something like that. David hasn't mentioned anything about family conflict or wedding guest issues. I don't think David knows yet. Sarah's letter suggested that this was a decision she made after conversations with him about family dynamics, but I suspect she's planning to present it to him as a done deal rather than as something they decided together. That's very concerning. Eleanor, can I ask what happened that led to this decision? I mean, you don't have to share family business if you'd prefer not to, but I'm trying to understand how we got to this point. Linda, I think Sarah has been comparing our family's communication style to yours, and she's decided that your approach to boundaries and support is healthier than mine. She's interpreted my enthusiasm about the wedding as controlling behavior, and my offers to help with planning and expenses as attempts to manipulate her choices. Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I've been worried about this exact situation. What do you mean? I mean that I've noticed Sarah making comments about how different our families are, and how much she appreciates our hands-off approach, and I've been concerned that she was using our family as a way to criticize yours. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to David and me either, because it puts us in the position of being the good in-laws while you're somehow the problematic one. I appreciate you saying that, Linda. It's been a very confusing and painful experience, especially because I thought I was being supportive and loving, not controlling and overwhelming. From everything I've observed, you have been supportive and loving. Sarah is lucky to have a mother who is so excited about her happiness and so generous with her time and resources. I think she's going through some kind of pre-wedding stress that's making her see problems where they don't exist. The thing is, Linda, I don't want to create conflict between Sarah and David, or between David and his family. But I also don't want to just disappear quietly and pretend that being excluded from my daughter's wedding is acceptable to me. Of course not. What are you thinking about doing? And that's when I shared my idea with Linda, an idea that would become the foundation for the most spectacular wedding gift any couple had ever received, and the most elegant demonstration of what happens when you underestimate Eleanor Walsh. Linda, what if we planned a second celebration for David and Sarah? Something that happens after their intimate backyard ceremony. Something that gives them the luxury wedding experience they could never afford on their own. Something so beautiful and meaningful that it becomes the wedding they'll actually remember for the rest of their lives? Eleanor, that's a wonderful idea, but wouldn't that require Sarah's permission and involvement? Not necessarily. What if we planned it as a surprise? What if we told them it was a reception hosted by David's family to celebrate the marriage and welcome Sarah into the Chen family? They couldn't object to that without seeming ungracious, and by the time they realized the scale and sophistication of what we'd created, it would be too late to protest. But Eleanor, that would be incredibly expensive. David and I couldn't possibly afford the kind of celebration you're talking about. Linda, you wouldn't be paying for it. This would be my wedding gift to David and Sarah. The gift of a celebration that shows them what their marriage is worth to the people who love them, regardless of what they think they want or deserve. Eleanor, I can't let you pay for an entire wedding reception. That's too generous, and it puts David and me in an impossible position. Linda, you wouldn't be letting me do anything. You'd be helping me give my daughter the wedding celebration she deserves, while teaching her a lesson about the consequences of excluding people who love her from the most important moments of their lives. I'm not sure I understand. Sarah has decided that your family's approach to love and support is superior to mine. She wants the quiet, respectful boundaries that you provide, rather than the enthusiastic involvement that I offer. So let's give her exactly what she's asked for. What? Do you mean? I mean that we'll plan this celebration together, as a partnership between David's family and Sarah's family. But when the day comes, when Sarah sees what we've created for them, she'll discover that the grandmother financial resources she's been taking for granted all these years, the connections and expertise she's been dismissing as overwhelming, and the love she's been rejecting as too much, are exactly what made this magical experience possible. Eleanor, I think I see where you're going with this, but I'm still not comfortable with you paying for everything. Linda, what if we approached it this way? You and your family are hosting the reception, providing the venue and the family blessing. I'm providing the planning, coordination, and financial resources as my wedding gift to the couple. We're working together to create something beautiful for David and Sarah, just like we would if we were planning any other family celebration. That actually sounds reasonable. And it would be a way for us to welcome Sarah into our family in a meaningful way. Exactly. And Linda, I promise you that by the end of this process, Sarah will understand exactly what she was rejecting when she decided that my love was too overwhelming to include in her wedding. How so? Because she's going to discover that the mother she thought was too dramatic and controlling to invite to her intimate backyard ceremony is the same mother who just gave her the most beautiful wedding celebration of her dreams. And she's going to have to reconcile those two versions of me in front of everyone she cares about. Linda was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear her thinking through the implications of what I was proposing. Eleanor, I have to ask, is this about giving Sarah a beautiful wedding, or is this about proving a point? Linda, it's about both. I want Sarah to have a wedding celebration that reflects how much she's loved and valued by her family. But I also want her to understand that love and support come in different forms, and that rejecting someone's way of showing love doesn't make that love disappear. It just means you might miss out on what that love could have provided. And what happens if Sarah is angry about the surprise? What if she sees this as exactly the kind of overwhelming, controlling behavior that made her want to exclude you in the first place? Then she'll have to explain to everyone at her reception why she's angry about receiving the most generous, beautiful wedding gift anyone has ever given her. She'll have to tell David's extended family, their friends, and anyone else who attends why she's upset about her mother's love being too generous and her celebration being too spectacular. Eleanor, that's actually quite brilliant. Linda, I've spent 15 years building a business that creates once-in-a-lifetime experiences for people who appreciate excellence. Sarah has no idea what I'm capable of when I'm not trying to respect her boundaries and manage her comfort level. She's about to find out. What exactly are you envisioning for this celebration? And that's when I shared with Linda the vision that had been forming in my mind ever since I'd read Sarah's rejection letter. A vision that would transform her simple backyard wedding into something that belonged in a luxury wedding magazine. Something so sophisticated and beautiful that everyone who attended would talk about it for years. Linda, what if we took David's parents' backyard and transformed it into something from a fairy tale? What if we brought in landscape designers to create garden spaces that look like they've been growing there for decades? What if we installed lighting that makes the entire space feel magical after sunset? What if we hired the kind of catering and service staff that usually work celebrity events? Eleanor, that sounds incredible. But David's parents' backyard isn't large enough for that kind of elaborate setup. Actually, Linda, I drove by their house yesterday evening, and I think you'd be surprised what's possible with the right design and planning. The lot is nearly an acre, and most of it is underutilized space that could be transformed into different celebration areas with the right approach. You drove by their house? I needed to see the space to understand what we'd be working with. Linda, I've planned events in venues much more challenging than a residential backyard. With the right team and sufficient resources, we could create something that rivals the most exclusive wedding venues in the state. What kind of timeline are we talking about? 6 weeks. I know it sounds impossible, but I have relationships with vendors who will move mountains when I call, and I have the financial resources to make expedited timelines worth their while. Eleanor, this is sounding very expensive. I'm getting concerned about the budget. Linda, let me worry about the budget. My only concern is whether you're comfortable being part of this project, and whether you think David and Sarah will be able to appreciate what we're creating for them. I think David will be thrilled. He's always wanted Sarah to have a beautiful wedding, but he's been worried about the financial stress of planning something elaborate. If we can give them a luxury celebration without putting financial pressure on them, he'll be over the moon. And Sarah? Sarah is more complicated. She says she wants something simple and intimate, but I've noticed that she spends a lot of time looking at luxury wedding photos on social media and talking about how beautiful elaborate weddings are. I think she's convinced herself that she wants something simple because she thinks that's more authentic and meaningful. But I suspect she'd be thrilled to have a spectacular celebration if it didn't come with guilt about the expense. Linda, by the time we're finished, Sarah will have both. She'll have her intimate, meaningful ceremony with just the people who matter most to her. And then she'll have a reception that's so beautiful and sophisticated that she'll feel like a princess, all without having to make a single decision or worry about a single detail. Eleanor, I have to say, this sounds like the most generous wedding gift I've ever heard of. But I'm still worried about Sarah's reaction when she realizes the scale of what you've done. Linda, here's what I've learned in 15 years of planning. Luxury events. People never regret having celebrations that exceed their expectations. They might feel guilty about the expense, or overwhelmed by the generosity, or concerned about seeming ungrateful. But they never regret having experiences that are more beautiful and meaningful than anything they could have created for themselves. And, you think this will help repair your relationship with Sarah? I think this will force Sarah to confront the reality of who I actually am versus who she's decided I am. She's convinced herself that my involvement in her life is overwhelming and controlling because she's only seen me in the context of our family relationship. She's never seen me in my professional context, where my enthusiasm and resources and connections are appreciated rather than resented. So this is partly about showing her your professional capabilities? Linda, this is about showing her that the mother she's been rejecting is the same person who just created the most beautiful day of her life. It's about demonstrating that love and support and generosity aren't problems to be managed. They're gifts to be appreciated. And if she's still angry, if she sees this as confirmation that you can't respect her boundaries, then she'll have to explain to everyone who attended her spectacular wedding reception why she's angry about receiving the most generous gift of her life. She'll have to tell David and his family and all their friends why having a celebration that exceeds their wildest dreams is evidence of her mother's inability to respect her wishes. Eleanor, you realize this is a very high-stakes gamble? If this goes wrong, it could damage your relationship with Sarah permanently. Linda, my relationship with Sarah is already damaged. She's decided that my love is a burden rather than a gift, that my enthusiasm is a problem rather than an asset, that my presence in her life requires emotional labor she's not willing to provide. I can't make that relationship worse by being generous and loving in a way that creates something beautiful for her, but you could make it worse by doing something she's specifically asked you not to do. Linda, she asked me not to attend her wedding ceremony. She didn't ask me not to give her a wedding gift. And if the most beautiful reception of her life happens to be that gift, well, she'll have to decide whether she's willing to reject generosity simply because it came from someone whose love she finds overwhelming. Linda was quiet for several minutes, and I could tell she was thinking through all the potential complications and consequences of what I was proposing. Eleanor, I need to be honest with you about something. Of course, I've been feeling terrible about this situation with Sarah. Not because I think you've done anything wrong, but because I can see how much you love her, and how much it's hurting you to be excluded from her wedding. David loves Sarah, but he also loves and respects his future mother-in-law, and I think he'd be horrified to know that Sarah has banned you from the ceremony. Do you think we should tell him? I think we should definitely tell him about the reception we're planning, and I think when he understands what you're doing for them, he'll realize how wrong Sarah has been about your motivations and your character. Linda, are you saying you're willing to partner with me on this project? Eleanor, I'm saying that I would be honored to help you give David and Sarah the wedding celebration they deserve. And I'm saying that if this is what it takes to show Sarah how lucky she is to have you as a mother, then I'm fully committed to making this the most spectacular event Portland has ever seen. Linda, you have no idea how much this means to me. Eleanor, you have no idea how much this is going to mean to David and Sarah. Even if Sarah is too stubborn to appreciate it at first, she'll spend the rest of her life knowing that her mother loved her enough to create something magical for her, even after being rejected and excluded. And Linda, when this is over, when Sarah sees what we've created for them, she's going to understand exactly what she was rejecting when she decided my love was too overwhelming to include in her wedding. I think you're right, and I think she's going to regret that decision for the rest of her life. The third call I made was to Marcus Beaumont, the landscape designer who had created the garden installations for 3 of my most high-profile events. Marcus was 52, had trained at the Royal Botanic Gardens in England, and had a reputation for creating outdoor spaces that looked like they had been designed by fairy tale illustrators. Marcus, I need you to work a miracle, and I need it done in 5 weeks. Eleanor, you know I love impossible deadlines. What are we transforming this time? A suburban backyard into the most romantic wedding venue Portland has ever seen. 1 acre of mostly bare lawn that needs to become a garden paradise that looks like it's been growing there for generations. How many guests? Approximately 100 to 150. We'll need multiple celebration areas: ceremony space, cocktail reception area, dinner space, and dancing area. All of it needs to feel intimate and magical despite the larger guest count. Budget? Unlimited. I want you to create something that makes people question whether they've stumbled into a secret garden that's been hidden in suburban Portland for decades. Eleanor, you know that kind of installation normally takes months of planning and preparation. Marcus, you also know that I pay immediately and in full, that I refer more high-value clients than any other event planner in the state, and that this project is going to be photographed by every luxury wedding publication in the Pacific Northwest. When do I get to see the space? Tomorrow morning. And Marcus, this project is confidential until the day of the event. The bride and groom don't know it's happening. Eleanor, you are either a fairy godmother or completely insane. Either way, I'm in. The 4th call was to Isabella Rodriguez, the executive chef who had catered my most exclusive events for the past 5 years. Isabella had trained in Paris, worked in Michelin-starred restaurants in New York, and had recently opened her own catering company that specialized in luxury events, where money was no object and perfection was the only acceptable outcome. Isabella, I need you to design a wedding menu that will ruin every other wedding meal these guests ever eat for the rest of their lives. Eleanor, you know I live for that kind of challenge. What's the occasion? My daughter's wedding reception. She doesn't know it's happening yet, but when she tastes what you create for her, she's going to understand that some gifts are too beautiful to reject, even when they come from people whose love feels overwhelming. Eleanor, that sounds like there's a story behind this event. Isabella, there's definitely a story. And when this is over, it's going to be a story that changes everything. By the end of that first day, I had assembled a team that could have planned a state dinner or a celebrity wedding with equal sophistication and success. I had Marcus designing garden installations that would rival the most exclusive private estates. I had Isabella creating a culinary experience that would be talked about for years. I had Maria coordinating logistics that would make the event run more smoothly than a Swiss watch. And I had Linda Chen as my partner, ally, and co-conspirator in demonstrating to Sarah exactly what she had been rejecting when she decided that Her mother's love was too overwhelming to include in her wedding, but most importantly, I had a plan that would transform Sarah's simple backyard wedding into the most spectacular celebration of her life, while teaching her a lesson about the consequences of underestimating the woman who had loved her, supported her, and believed in her for 32 years. The woman Sarah had dismissed as too dramatic and controlling to include in her intimate ceremony was about to create something so magnificent that she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand how she had been so wrong about everything, and it was going to be absolutely magnificent. To understand how my daughter could ban her own mother from her wedding and convince herself it was a reasonable response to boundary violations, you need to understand the family dynamic that had been systematically building since my husband Richard died 5 years ago. This wasn't a random act of pre-wedding stress. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to reposition me from beloved mother to problematic elderly parent who needs management. The transformation in how Sarah treated me didn't happen overnight. It began subtly in the weeks after Richard's funeral, when I was most vulnerable and least likely to recognize manipulation for what it was. But looking back now, I can see the precise moments when Sarah began testing whether she could reshape our relationship to better suit her emerging vision of herself as an independent adult who had outgrown her need for maternal involvement. Richard and I had been married for 42 years. We'd built a life together that was comfortable, professionally fulfilling, and deeply satisfying. He'd been a successful architect who specialized in sustainable residential design, while I'd managed the business operations of his firm and gradually developed my own expertise in interior design and project coordination. We complemented each other professionally and personally, in ways that made both of us stronger and more capable than we could have been individually. More importantly, we'd raised Sarah together as true partners, sharing responsibilities and decisions in ways that gave her a stable, consistent foundation throughout her childhood and adolescence. Richard handled homework help and bedtime stories. I managed social schedules and emotional support. He taught her to think critically and solve problems. I taught her to communicate effectively and build relationships. We were a unified front in every aspect of parenting, and Sarah had thrived under that consistent, coordinated approach. When Richard died after an 8-month battle with pancreatic cancer, I felt like the foundation of everything I understood about myself had been surgically removed. We'd been partners in every sense of the word, business collaborators, parenting allies, and best friends who genuinely enjoyed each other's company after more than 4 decades together. His death left me not just grieving the loss of my husband, but struggling to figure out who I was as an individual, rather than as half of a perfectly matched team. During those first months of widowhood, I was genuinely struggling. I was learning to make decisions that Richard and I had always made together, managing business relationships that had been built around our partnership, and trying to figure out what my life looked like when I was no longer someone's wife, but simply myself. I needed support, patience, and encouragement while I found my footing as a single person for the first time since I was 26 years old. What I got instead was Sarah's systematic campaign to convince me that I would never be capable of managing my own life without her guidance and oversight. Sarah, my 27-year-old daughter at the time, had always been what educators might charitably call precocious. Even as a child, she'd had strong opinions about how other people should live their lives, and she'd never hesitated to share those opinions whether they were requested or not. As an adult, she'd become a marketing manager at a tech startup, ACI, role that seemed to reinforce her natural tendency to believe she could analyze any situation and develop strategies for improvement. But more significantly, she'd recently started dating David Chen, whose family's approach to parent-adult-child relationships was becoming the template she used to evaluate every aspect of our family dynamic. And according to that template, Richard and I had been doing everything wrong for 30 years. The first indication that something fundamental was shifting in our relationship came during the process of planning Richard's memorial service. Richard had been very specific about his wishes. He wanted a celebration of life at our home, with close friends and family sharing stories and memories in the garden he'd spent 20 years designing and cultivating. He'd explicitly said he didn't want a formal funeral home service or anything that felt somber or depressing. But when I tried to honor those wishes, Sarah intervened with what she called realistic adjustments for your emotional state. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly right now," Sarah had said when I insisted on planning the service myself. "You're dealing with grief and stress, and trying to coordinate a big event on top of everything else is just going to overwhelm you. Let me handle the logistics so you can focus on processing your emotions." "Sarah, I appreciate the offer, but this is something I need to do. Your father and I talked about his memorial service extensively, and I know exactly what he wanted. I need to make sure his wishes are honored. But Mom, you don't understand how much work goes into organizing something like this. There are catering decisions, and setup logistics, and coordination with all the people who want to speak. You're already emotionally exhausted, and adding event planning stress is going to make everything harder for you." "Sweetheart, I've been planning events and managing logistics for your father's business for 20 years. A memorial service is well within my capabilities, even while I'm grieving. Mom, planning business events is totally different from planning something this personal and emotional. And besides, you've always had Dad to help with the big decisions. This is the first time you're having to handle everything by yourself." That phrase, "by yourself," would become a recurring theme in Sarah's approach to my widowhood. Every task I wanted to handle independently became evidence that I was taking on too much. Every decision I wanted to make without consultation became proof that I wasn't thinking clearly. Every indication that I was managing my life successfully became a reason for concern about whether I was pushing myself too hard. When I protested that I was perfectly capable of planning my own husband's memorial service, something I'd actually done for both my parents and Richard's parents over the years, Sarah exchanged that look with David, the one that said they were dealing with a difficult elderly person who didn't understand her own limitations. "Of course you're capable, Mom," David had said in the tone people use when they're managing someone who's becoming unreasonable. "But there's no reason to put that kind of stress on yourself when you have family who wants to help." Help. That word would become a weapon they used against me for the next 5 years. They took over the memorial planning completely, making decisions I disagreed with and dismissing my objections as emotional reactions that weren't practical or reasonable. They invited people Richard wouldn't have wanted there, chose catering that reflected their tastes rather than his, and planned a reception that was more about their social connections than about honoring his memory. When I tried to assert my preferences, I was told I was being difficult and not thinking about what's best for everyone involved. When I pointed out that Richard had specifically said he wanted an informal celebration rather than a formal reception, they said I was clinging to details instead of focusing on the bigger picture of helping people process their grief. The memorial service ended up being exactly what they wanted, and nothing like what Richard or I would have chosen. But worse than the specific decisions was the precedent they'd established. I was no longer considered competent to make important decisions about my own life. The second major warning sign came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Sarah suggested, "We should have a family meeting to discuss getting your finances organized for the future. Mom, we know Dad handled most of the money management, and we want to make sure you're set up for success going forward," Sarah had begun, arriving at my house with David and a folder full of printed research. "We've been reading about the best approaches for widows in your situation, and we think the smartest thing would be to simplify everything so you don't have to worry about complicated financial decisions." "What do you mean by simplify?" I'd asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "Well, we've been researching the best options for people transitioning to fixed incomes, and we think you should consolidate everything into simple checking and savings accounts," David had explained. consulting what looked like a financial planning worksheet. That way you won't have to keep track of multiple investments or worry about market fluctuations affecting your security. I'd stared at them in disbelief. Richard and I had spent 25 years building a carefully diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and retirement accounts. We'd weathered multiple market downturns and had seen our investments grow substantially over time. They were suggesting I liquidate everything and put it in accounts that would earn essentially no interest while inflation slowly eroded my purchasing power. Also, Sarah had added, we think it would be smart to set up online access for me so I can help you monitor your accounts and make sure everything is running smoothly. That way, if there are any problems or suspicious transactions, I can catch them before they become serious issues. Help me monitor my accounts. They wanted access to my money. I appreciate your concern, I'd said carefully. But I think I'd like to meet with our financial advisor before making any major changes. Your father and I always made these kinds of decisions together, and I want to make sure I understand all my options before doing anything dramatic. The response had been immediate and coordinated, as if they'd rehearsed it. Mom, financial advisors are just salespeople who want to make commissions off your investments, Sarah had said with the authority of someone who'd clearly done her research. They'll try to convince you to buy expensive products you don't need and don't understand, especially when they know you're vulnerable right now. Mom, there are a lot of people who specifically target recent widows and try to take advantage of their confusion during the grieving process, David had added, leaning forward with what he probably thought was a concerned expression. We just want to protect you from making decisions you might regret later when you're thinking more clearly. Recent widows, vulnerable, confusion. The language they used made it clear how they saw me, not as their capable mother who had helped manage a successful business for 20 years, but as a potential victim who needed their protection from my own poor judgment. When I insisted that I wanted to handle my own finances, at least until I'd had time to research my options and speak with professionals, they'd reluctantly backed down. But I could see the frustration in their eyes, and I'd heard Sarah whisper to David as they left, "She's going to make this so much harder than it needs to be." Over the next few months, Sarah began a subtle but systematic campaign to isolate me from friends and activities while positioning herself as my primary source of social connection and guidance. It started with comments about my driving, my social commitments, and my ability to manage household responsibilities independently. "Mom, are you sure you should be driving to book club after dark?" Sarah would ask whenever I mentioned evening activities. "Your night vision isn't what it used to be, and there are so many distracted drivers out there these days. Maybe you should start limiting your driving to daytime trips on familiar routes." I'd been driving safely for over 50 years, with only one minor fender bender in my entire driving history, an accident that had been the other driver's fault when he ran a red light. But suddenly, every trip I took became an opportunity for Sarah to express concern about my safety behind the wheel. "Mom, maybe you should ask me for rides when you need to go places," she'd suggest. "I'm happy to take you shopping or to appointments, and that way we know you got there safely." But when I did call for rides, Sarah was often unavailable, too busy, or could only take me at times that didn't work with my schedule. The message was clear. I should limit my activities to what was convenient for her, when it was convenient for her. She also began expressing skepticism about my friendships and social activities. When I mentioned having lunch with my longtime friend Margaret Thompson, Sarah would ask probing questions. "What do you really know about Margaret's financial situation? Are you sure she doesn't have ulterior motives for suddenly wanting to spend so much time with a recent widow?" When I talked about activities at the local community center, art classes, book clubs, and social groups I'd been participating in for years, Sarah would suggest that I was wearing myself out and should take things slower while you're processing your grief. When I mentioned new people I'd met or places I'd gone, David would warn me about people who prey on seniors and suggest I should be more cautious about trusting strangers during this vulnerable time in your life. Over time, it became easier to stop mentioning my social activities than to deal with their constant warnings and concerns. They interpreted my silence as evidence that I was, indeed, becoming isolated and dependent on them for social interaction. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of their campaign was the way they weaponized concern about my physical and mental health. Every minor ache, pain, or moment of forgetfulness became evidence that I was declining and needed closer supervision. When I mentioned having a headache one afternoon after spending the morning dealing with insurance paperwork, Sarah immediately insisted I should see a doctor to rule out anything serious. When I said it was probably just tension from dealing with bureaucracy, she suggested that headaches in people my age could be signs of high blood pressure, mini-strokes, or worse. When I couldn't immediately remember the name of Richard's college roommate during a conversation about old friends, David suggested I should consider having my memory tested. Mom, memory problems can be early signs of dementia or Alzheimer's. It's better to catch these things early so we can plan accordingly. When I slipped on a wet spot in the grocery store but caught myself without falling, Sarah launched into a lecture about fall risks for seniors and suggested I should consider using a walking stick, just to be safe, especially when you're out, alone. Every normal part of aging, occasional forgetfulness, minor aches and pains, moments of clumsiness, was treated as evidence of serious decline that required their intervention and oversight. But when I had my annual physical and my doctor pronounced me in excellent health for my age, Sarah dismissed the positive news with comments like, "Doctors don't always catch everything in routine exams," and "You should probably get a second opinion from a geriatric specialist." They wanted me to be declining because my decline justified their increasing control over my life. The most painful aspect of their manipulation was the way they began using my grief as evidence of emotional instability. Every mention of missing Richard, every moment of sadness about being alone, every expression of loneliness was interpreted as a sign that I wasn't processing my grief in a healthy way and needed professional intervention. "Mom, it's been 6 months since Dad died, and you're still crying when you talk about him," Sarah had said after I'd gotten emotional while sorting through Richard's clothes. "I think it might be time to consider grief counseling or maybe even medication to help you work through these feelings." Sarah, 6 months is not a long time when you're grieving the loss of someone you were married to for 42 years. Crying when I miss your father is normal and healthy, not a sign of mental illness. But Mom, you can't stay stuck in the grieving process forever. At some point, you need to start moving forward and building a new life for yourself. I am building a new life for myself. I'm learning to live independently. I'm maintaining my friendships. I'm staying active and engaged. I'm just doing it while also missing the person I loved most in the world. But Mom, constantly talking about Dad and getting emotional about him isn't fair to the people around you. It makes social situations uncomfortable when you start crying about how much you miss him. This had been genuinely shocking to me. Sarah was suggesting that my grief for her father was inappropriate social behavior that made other people uncomfortable. She was implying that missing Richard was a character flaw that I needed to correct, rather than a natural response to profound loss. "Sarah, are you saying that I shouldn't talk about your father or express emotion when I miss him?" "I'm saying that healthy grieving involves learning to remember Dad without falling apart every time his name comes up. You need to find ways to honor his memory that don't involve making everyone around you worry about your emotional stability." The irony was that I wasn't falling apart every time Richard's name came up. I was missing him, which was natural and appropriate. I was honoring his memory, which was healthy and important. I was learning to live without him while still acknowledging the impact he'd had on my life, which was exactly what grief counselors recommend. But according to Sarah's assessment, any visible emotion about Richard's death was evidence that I wasn't moving forward appropriately and needed intervention to help me process my feelings more constructively. By the 1-year anniversary of Richard's death, Sarah had successfully positioned herself as the final arbiter of what was appropriate, safe and reasonable for me to do. Every decision I wanted to make was subject to her approval, and every choice she disagreed with was evidence of my poor judgment or emotional instability. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate the master bedroom, something that would help me create a space that felt like mine rather than a shrine to my married life, Sarah immediately objected. "Mom, you shouldn't make major decorating decisions while you're still in the early stages of grief. You might choose colors or furniture that you'll regret once your emotions stabilize and you're thinking more clearly." When I said I'd been thinking about getting a small dog for companionship, something Richard and I had always planned to do once he retired, David launched into a lecture about the responsibilities of pet ownership. "Mom, pets require a lot of daily care and attention. What if you get sick and can't walk it? What if it damages the house? What if it's too energetic and knocks you down?" When I mentioned casually that I might like to take a vacation somewhere Richard and I had never been together, maybe a cruise or a trip to Europe, Sarah immediately began listing all the ways travel could be dangerous for someone my age. Foreign, medical care, unfamiliar foods, jet lag, walking on uneven surfaces, language barriers. There are so many things that could go wrong when you're traveling alone. Every interest I expressed, every plan I considered, every desire I mentioned was met with a litany of potential problems and reasons why I should reconsider. Over time, I stopped sharing my thoughts and dreams with them because I was tired of being made to feel foolish for wanting anything beyond the most basic, cautious existence. But the most devastating aspect of their manipulation was the way they began comparing me to David's mother, Linda Chen, as a way to illustrate everything that was wrong with our family dynamic. "Mom, I've been learning so much from Linda about healthy boundaries between parents and adult children," Sarah had said during one of our increasingly strained conversations. "She's so respectful of David's independence and autonomy. She never tries to solve his problems for him or get overly involved in his decisions." "I don't think I try to solve your problems for you, Sarah. I offer support when you ask for it, and I try to be available when you need help. But that's just it, Mom. You offer support even when I don't ask for it, and you try to be available for things I should be handling myself." Linda waits to be asked for help, and then she provides just enough assistance to be supportive without taking over. "Can you give me an example of when I took over something you should have been handling yourself?" "Well, like when I was having problems with my landlord last year. I mentioned it to you as a way of venting my frustration, but you immediately started researching tenant rights and offering to call the property management company on my behalf. Sarah, I was trying to help you understand your options and offer assistance if you wanted it. I didn't call anyone without your permission, and I didn't take any action that you didn't approve. But don't you see how that changes the dynamic? Instead of me working through the problem and developing my own solution, I ended up relying on your research and your suggestions. It made me feel like I couldn't handle the situation without parental intervention. But sweetheart, that's how families support each other. When someone you love is dealing with a challenge, you offer resources and assistance to help them navigate it successfully. But Linda's approach is so much healthier. When David has problems, she listens empathetically and expresses confidence in his ability to handle whatever he's facing. She doesn't try to research solutions or offer to intervene. She just trusts that he's capable of figuring things out. And what happens if David's problems are too big for him to handle alone? What if he needs more support than just emotional encouragement? Then he asks for specific help with specific aspects of the problem, and she provides exactly what he's requested without trying to take over the whole situation. This conversation had been a turning point in our relationship, though I hadn't fully understood it at the time. Sarah had begun using Linda Chen as the template for appropriate mothering, and according to that template, every aspect of my parenting style was problematic. Where I was proactive, Linda was reactive. Where I was involved, Linda was hands-off. Where I offered resources and assistance, Linda waited to be asked and then provided minimal help. where I expressed enthusiasm about Sarah's life and choices, Linda apparently maintained appropriate emotional distance from David's decisions. The irony was that Sarah was comparing a relationship with a mother-in-law she'd known for 8 months to a relationship with a mother who had raised her for 27 years. Linda's appropriate boundaries were easy to maintain because she wasn't responsible for David's emotional development, financial security, or long-term well-being. Her job was to be supportive and welcoming, not to provide the kind of deep, sustained love and guidance that parents give their own children. But Sarah had convinced herself that Linda's approach to relationships was superior to mine, and that my 30 years of active, involved parenting had been a form of boundary violation that had prevented her from developing proper independence and autonomy. The final escalation came when Sarah announced her engagement to David, and I made the mistake of expressing genuine excitement about planning her wedding. "Mom, we're engaged!" she'd squealed over the phone, her voice bubbling with joy and anticipation. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so happy for you," I'd responded, immediately thinking about all the ways I could help make her wedding dreams come true. "We need to celebrate, and we should start thinking about venues and dresses and all the wonderful details that are going to make your day perfect." "Mom," Sarah had said, her tone shifting from excitement to caution, "I need you to understand that David and I want to plan our own wedding. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we want to make our own decisions without a lot of input or suggestions." "Of course, honey. I'm not trying to make decisions for you. I'm just excited about helping you explore your options and create the celebration you're dreaming of." But that's exactly what I'm talking about. You immediately started talking about venues and dresses and details, as if you're already planning the wedding in your head. Linda's first response when David told her we were engaged was to congratulate us and ask when we wanted to have dinner to celebrate. She didn't start planning anything or making suggestions about what we should do. "Sarah, I wasn't planning anything. I was just sharing your excitement and thinking about all the wonderful possibilities ahead of you." "But Mom, that's the problem. Your excitement feels like pressure, because I know you're going to have opinions about every decision we make, and I'm going to end up worrying about disappointing you if I choose something different from what you would prefer." "Sweetheart, my excitement doesn't come with expectations. I'm happy about whatever choices make you happy." "But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you get emotionally invested in outcomes, which makes me feel responsible for managing your emotions along with my own." That conversation had set the tone for the 8 months of wedding planning that followed. 8 months during which every expression of interest or offer of assistance on my part was interpreted as evidence that I was too emotionally invested in Sarah's choices and unable to respect her autonomy as an adult. When I asked about their vision for the ceremony, I was pressuring them to make decisions before they were ready. When I shared articles about wedding trends, I was trying to influence their choices. When I offered to help with vendor research, I was taking over aspects of the planning that they should be handling themselves. Meanwhile, Linda Chen's quiet, hands-off approach was constantly praised as the model of appropriate mother-in-law behavior. Linda waited to be asked questions before offering opinions. Linda never volunteered suggestions or shared resources unless specifically requested. Linda never expressed strong emotions about wedding decisions or showed enthusiasm that might be interpreted as pressure. Linda, in other words, was everything that Sarah had decided I was not. Appropriately boundaried, respectfully distant, and emotionally uninvested in outcomes that didn't directly affect her. But what Sarah didn't understand, what she had never bothered to learn, was that Linda's approach worked for her because she wasn't Sarah's mother. She wasn't the person who had raised Sarah, supported her through every challenge, celebrated every achievement, and invested 3 decades of love and energy into her well-being and happiness. Linda could maintain emotional distance because Sarah wasn't her daughter. She could avoid expressing strong opinions because David's choices didn't reflect 30 years of her parenting and guidance. She could wait to be asked for help because she hadn't spent Sarah's entire childhood anticipating her needs and providing support before problems became crises. But Sarah had convinced herself that Linda's relationship style was superior to mine. and that my inability to maintain the same emotional distance was evidence of unhealthy attachment and boundary violations. The wedding ban had been the inevitable conclusion of 5 years of systematic repositioning. Sarah had successfully transformed our relationship from loving mother and grateful daughter to problematic elderly parent and responsible adult child who needs to set boundaries. She'd convinced herself that my love was overwhelming, my support was controlling, my enthusiasm was pressure, and my presence at her wedding would be a threat to her happiness and autonomy. But what Sarah didn't know, what she was about to discover, was that the mother she'd been systematically underestimating for 5 years was far more capable, far more powerful, and far more generous than she'd ever imagined. The woman she'd convinced herself was too emotionally involved to respect her boundaries was about to demonstrate exactly what appropriate boundaries looked like when they were maintained by someone with actual power and resources. And the mother she'd decided was too overwhelming to include in her wedding was about to become the woman whose exclusion would create consequences that Sarah would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. The pattern of manipulation and control that Sarah had been building for 5 years was about to be exposed for exactly what it was: the systematic undermining of a woman whose only crime had been loving her daughter too generously and supporting her too enthusiastically. And that revelation was going to change everything. The 6 weeks that followed my alliance with Linda Chen became the most intense and exhilarating period of my professional life. What we were attempting, transforming a suburban backyard into a luxury wedding venue worthy of international attention, was the kind of project that normally required 6 months of planning and preparation. But I had something that most event planners could only dream of: unlimited resources, a network of vendors who trusted my vision completely, and the motivation that comes from being spectacularly underestimated by someone you love. Marcus Beaumont began work on the landscape transformation 3 days after our initial conversation. What he created over the following 5 weeks defied every assumption about what was possible in residential outdoor spaces. Using a combination of mature plantings, architectural lighting, and custom installations, he transformed the Chen family's ordinary backyard into what looked like a secret garden that had been growing for decades. Eleanor, this is either the most ambitious project of my career or complete madness, Marcus had said during the first week of installation, as crews worked around the clock to install irrigation systems and prepare planting areas. But I have to admit, watching this transformation happen is like watching magic. The magic involved installing over 200 mature plants, flowering trees, ornamental shrubs, and perennial gardens that created the illusion of seasonal beauty that had been carefully cultivated over years. Marcus brought in specimen trees that were 30 to 40 years old, positioning them as if they had always been part of the landscape design. He created pathways using reclaimed stone that looked like it had been weathered by decades of use. He installed water features that seemed to emerge naturally from the garden environment. But perhaps most impressively, he designed lighting systems that would transform the entire space after sunset. Hidden LED installations throughout the plantings, uplighting for the mature trees, and string lights woven through the canopy created an environment that would feel magical rather than artificial. During the day, guests would see a beautiful garden. After sunset, they would feel like they had entered a fairy tale. "Marcus, this is beyond anything I imagined," I said during the 4th week, as the final plantings were being installed. "It looks like this garden has been here for generations." "Eleanor, that's exactly what we were going for. But I have to tell you, this installation is going to be featured in every landscape design publication in the country. This is the kind of transformation that wins industry awards." While Marcus worked his magic on the landscape, Isabella Rodriguez was creating what she called the most sophisticated outdoor dining experience I've ever designed. Working with Linda Chen to understand David's family's food preferences and Sarah's dietary restrictions, Isabella developed a menu that would satisfy 150 guests while accommodating every possible dietary need without anyone feeling like they were eating special food. "Eleanor, I want every bite of this meal to be perfect," Isabella had said during one of our planning sessions. "This is going to be the kind of dinner that people talk about for years. Not just because it's delicious, but because it's so thoughtfully designed that every guest feels like it was planned specifically for them." The menu Isabella created read, "Like something from a Michelin-starred restaurant. Locally sourced salmon with herb crusts, grass-fed beef with seasonal vegetable accompaniments, vegetarian options that were so sophisticated that even dedicated carnivores would be impressed." But more importantly, she designed service systems that would make the entire dinner feel effortless, courses that appeared seamlessly, wine pairings that enhanced every dish, and dessert presentations that would provide Instagram-worthy moments for every guest. "Isabella, this menu is going to cost more than most people's entire wedding budgets," I'd said while reviewing the final proposal. "Eleanor, this menu is going to create an experience that makes everyone who attends this reception understand exactly what they've been invited to witness. This isn't just dinner. This is a demonstration of what becomes possible when someone with your resources decides to create something extraordinary." But perhaps the most crucial element of our planning was the coordination with Linda Chen, who had become not just my co-conspirator, but my closest ally in demonstrating to Sarah exactly what she had been rejecting for the past 5 years. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something," Linda had said during our third planning meeting. "I've been watching Sarah's behavior toward you, and I've been getting increasingly uncomfortable with how she talks about your relationship." "What do you mean?" "I mean that she constantly criticizes your parenting style and your approach to family relationships, using my family as an example of how things should be done. But what she doesn't seem to understand is that comparing a mother-in-law relationship to a mother-daughter relationship is completely inappropriate. I've been wondering about that. It seemed like she was expecting me to maintain the same emotional distance that you maintain with David, but that never felt right to me. Eleanor, it's not right. David is my son, and I love him deeply. But Sarah is your daughter, someone you raised and supported for 30 years. The idea that you should treat her with the same polite boundaries that I maintain with my daughter-in-law is absurd. Have you talked to David about this? That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. David has no idea that Sarah banned you from the wedding. She told him that you had decided not to attend because you wanted them to have an intimate celebration without extended family complications. I stared at Linda in shock. She lied to him? Completely. David thinks you made a generous, selfless decision to give them space for their special day. He's been telling people how grateful he is that his future mother-in-law is so understanding and supportive. Linda, this changes everything. If David doesn't know that Sarah banned me from the wedding, then he doesn't know that she's been systematically trying to exclude me from their relationship. Eleanor, I think David needs to understand what's really been happening, and I think our surprise reception is the perfect way to show him. What do you mean? I mean that when David sees what you've created for them, when he understands the generosity and love behind this celebration, he's going to realize that Sarah has been completely wrong about your motivations and your character. And when he learns that you did all of this after being banned from their wedding, he's going to understand exactly what kind of person he's marrying. That conversation led to what became the most strategically brilliant aspect of our entire plan. Linda arranged for David to visit his parents' house the day before the wedding, ostensibly to help with some simple reception preparations that his family was hosting to welcome Sarah into the Chen family. When David arrived to find crews putting finishing touches on what looked like the most spectacular wedding venue he'd ever seen, his reaction was everything we had hoped for and more. "Mom, what is this?" David had asked, staring in amazement at the transformed backyard. "This looks like something from a luxury wedding magazine." "David, this is what happens when you have a future mother-in-law who understands that some occasions deserve to be Celebrated in ways that exceed all expectations, Linda had replied, gesturing toward where I was consulting with the lighting designer about final adjustments. Mrs. Walsh did all of this? Your future mother-in-law has spent the past 6 weeks creating what is essentially a luxury wedding venue in our backyard as her gift to you and Sarah. She wanted to make sure that your wedding celebration was as beautiful and meaningful as your love for each other. David walked through the garden installation, examining the mature plantings, the custom lighting, the areas designated for different aspects of the celebration. When he reached the dinner space, where Isabella's team was setting up stations for the most sophisticated outdoor dining experience Portland had ever seen, he stopped walking and just stared. Mom, this must have cost a fortune. How could Mrs. Walsh afford to do something like this? David, your future mother-in-law is a successful businesswoman who has the resources to create whatever she sets her mind to. The question isn't how. She could afford it. The question is why she chose to do it. What do you mean? I mean that Eleanor Walsh has spent 6 weeks creating the most generous wedding gift I've ever seen, for a daughter who told her that her presence at the wedding would be too dramatic and overwhelming. What are you talking about? Sarah never said anything about Mrs. Walsh being dramatic or overwhelming. She said Mrs. Walsh decided not to attend because she wanted us to have an intimate family celebration. David, Sarah banned her mother from your wedding. Eleanor has no idea that you don't know that. The conversation that followed was one of the most uncomfortable discussions Linda had ever had with her son, but it was also one of the most necessary. David learned that his fiancé had systematically excluded her mother from their wedding planning, had convinced Eleanor that her enthusiasm was unwelcome, and had lied to him about Eleanor's reasons for not attending the ceremony. David, your future mother-in-law has spent 6 weeks creating something extraordinary for you and Sarah, despite being told that her love was too overwhelming to include in your wedding. What does that tell you about her character? It tells me that Sarah has been completely wrong about everything, David had replied, his voice tight with anger and disappointment. How could she lie to me about something this important? More importantly, how could she treat someone who loves her this much with such cruelty and disrespect? Mom, what do I do with this information? We're getting married tomorrow. David, you marry the woman you love, and you spend the rest of your life making sure she understands how lucky she is to have Eleanor Walsh as a mother. And tomorrow night, when you see what Eleanor has created for you, you make sure Sarah understands that this is what real love looks like when it's given freely and generously. The day of the wedding arrived with the kind of perfect May weather that wedding planners pray for: clear skies, warm temperatures, and a gentle breeze that would make outdoor celebrations comfortable and magical. Sarah and David's intimate backyard ceremony proceeded exactly as they had planned it, with just their immediate families and closest friends witnessing their vows in the Chen family's front garden. I watched the ceremony from my living room window, using binoculars to see my daughter marry the man she loved. It was both heartbreaking and empowering. Heartbreaking because I was witnessing one of the most important moments of Sarah's life from a distance. Empowering because I knew that in 3 hours, everything would change. The ceremony was beautiful and meaningful, exactly what Sarah had said she wanted. David looked handsome and nervous in his navy suit. Sarah was radiant in a simple but elegant dress that she'd chosen without my input or assistance. Their vows were personal and heartfelt, bringing tears to the eyes of everyone who witnessed them. But as I watched through my binoculars, I could see the exact moment when Sarah realized that something was different about the backyard where their reception was supposed to take place. The ceremony ended at 4 p.m. The reception was scheduled to begin at 5:30 p.m., giving guests time to congratulate the couple and move from the front garden to the backyard for cocktails and dinner. But when the first guests walked into the backyard space, the reactions were exactly what we had planned for. "Oh my God," I heard someone say, their voice carrying across the garden. "This is incredible. How did you create something this beautiful?" "This looks like a luxury resort," someone else added. "I can't believe this is the same backyard we were in last month." From my window, I could see guests walking through Marcus's garden installation with expressions of amazement and delight. The mature plantings, the custom lighting, the elegant seating areas, everything combined to create an environment that looked like it had been designed by fairy tale illustrators. But the real magic happened when Sarah and David walked into their reception space for the first time. Sarah stopped walking as soon as she saw what had been created for them. She stood at the entrance to the garden, staring at the transformed space with an expression that shifted from confusion to amazement to something that looked like panic. "David, what is this?" I could hear her asking, her voice carrying the kind of tension that comes from realizing that something is happening that you don't understand and can't control. "Sarah, this is our reception. This is what my family wanted to create for us to welcome you into the Chen family. But this isn't what we planned. We planned simple cocktails and appetizers in your parents' backyard. This looks like a luxury wedding venue. Sarah, sometimes the people who love you want to give you gifts that exceed your expectations." I watched through my binoculars as Sarah walked through the garden, examining the installations and trying to understand how her simple backyard reception had been transformed into something that belonged in wedding magazines. Her body language shifted from amazement to anxiety as she began to realize that this level of sophistication and expense was far beyond anything the Chen family could have arranged on their own. The moment of truth came when Isabella's catering team began serving cocktails and appetizers that were clearly far more sophisticated than anything Sarah had planned or budged for. "David, this food is incredible," I heard one of their friends saying. "Where did you find this catering company?" "This isn't just catering," someone else added. "This is restaurant-quality cuisine. How did you afford something like this?" "I could." See Sarah pulling David aside for a private conversation, her gestures indicating stress and confusion about what was happening at her own reception. And that's when Linda Chen made her move. "Ladies and gentlemen," Linda announced, her voice carrying across the garden as she called for everyone's attention. "Before we continue with this beautiful celebration, there's something that David and Sarah need to know about how this magical evening became possible." The garden fell silent as guests turned toward Linda, many of them holding cocktails and appetizers that were clearly far more sophisticated than anything they'd expected at a simple backyard reception. This evening, this incredible garden, this exquisite dinner, this celebration that will create memories for all of us for years to come, has been created as a wedding gift from someone who loves David and Sarah more than words can express. I watched Sarah's face as understanding began to dawn. Her expression shifted from confusion to dread as she started to realize who was responsible for the transformation of her simple reception into something extraordinary. Eleanor Walsh, Sarah's mother and David's future mother-in-law, has spent the past 6 weeks creating what you see around you tonight. Every plant, every light, every detail of this celebration has been designed and funded by a woman who wanted to make sure that David and Sarah's wedding was as beautiful and meaningful as their love for each other. The silence that followed Linda's announcement was profound. Every guest was processing the implications of what they'd just learned, that the mother of the bride, who was notably absent from the ceremony, had somehow been responsible for creating the most spectacular wedding reception any of them had ever attended. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother isn't even here. She decided not to come to the wedding." "Sarah," Linda said gently, "your mother is here. She's been here all day, making sure that every detail of this celebration was perfect for you. Eleanor, would you please join us?" And that's when I made my entrance. I had chosen my outfit carefully for this moment, an elegant navy dress with subtle beading that was sophisticated without being ostentatious, paired with pearls that Richard had given me for our 25th anniversary. I looked like exactly what I was, a successful, confident woman who had the resources and connections to create magical experiences for people she loved. Walking into that garden was one of the most emotionally complex moments of my life. I was entering a space that I had created, approaching a daughter who had banned me from her wedding, surrounded by guests who were just beginning to understand the story behind the evening they were experiencing. The reactions were immediate and intense. David rushed toward me with an expression of gratitude and respect that I hadn't seen from him in years. Several guests who knew me professionally began applauding. Others stared in amazement as they realized that the absent mother of the bride was actually the architect of everything they were experiencing. But it was Sarah's reaction that mattered most. She stood frozen in the center of the garden, staring at me with an expression that shifted between shock, confusion, gratitude, and something that looked like devastation. "Mom," she whispered, "what did you do?" "I gave you a wedding gift, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure that your celebration was as beautiful as you deserve. But how... I don't understand how this is possible." "Sarah," I said gently, "this is possible because I have resources and connections that you've never bothered to learn about. This is possible because I've spent 15 years building a business that creates experiences like this for people who appreciate excellence. This is possible because I love you enough to create something magical for you, even after you decided that my love was too overwhelming to include in your wedding." The conversation that followed took place in front of 150 guests who were witnessing one of the most dramatic family reckonings any of them had ever seen. Sarah was learning, in real time, that everything she thought she knew about her mother was wrong. David was discovering that his wife had lied to him about fundamental aspects of their wedding planning. The guests were realizing that they were witnessing the most generous and sophisticated response to family conflict they'd ever encountered. "Mom, I had no idea you were capable of creating something like this," Sarah said, gesturing at the transformed garden around us. "Sarah, you never bothered to learn what I was capable of. You were too busy convincing yourself that my enthusiasm was a problem and my involvement was overwhelming. But this must have cost a fortune. How could you afford something this elaborate?" "Sarah, I could afford this because I'm not the financially dependent elderly woman you've been treating me like for the past 5 years. I'm a successful businesswoman with substantial resources who chose to invest those resources in creating something beautiful for your wedding. Why didn't you tell me you had this kind of money? Why didn't you tell me you had this kind of business? Because every time I tried to share my professional achievements with you, you found ways to diminish them or suggest that I was taking on too much for someone my age. So I learned to keep my success to myself while you continued to treat me like someone who needed your guidance and management." The most powerful moment came when David stepped forward to address what had become not just a family conversation, but a public reckoning with 5 years of systematic underestimation and manipulation. "Sarah," David said, his voice carrying a combination of love and disappointment that made several guests look uncomfortable, "do you realize what you've done here?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that you banned your mother from our wedding because you decided her love was too overwhelming, and she responded by creating the most generous, beautiful gift either of us will ever receive. You treated her like a problem to be managed, and she treated you like a daughter who deserved to have her dreams exceeded. David, I was trying to protect our boundaries and our independence. Sarah, you were trying to control someone whose only crime was loving you more enthusiastically than you were comfortable with. And now everyone here gets to see what you rejected when you decided that your mother's way of showing love wasn't appropriate for your standards." The hour that followed was unlike anything any of the guests had ever experienced at a wedding reception. They were witnessing a real-time education about family dynamics, generosity, and the consequences of underestimating people who love you. They were eating food and experiencing an environment that exceeded anything they could have imagined, while watching a mother demonstrate grace under pressure and a daughter confront the reality of her own behavior. But perhaps most importantly, they were seeing the difference between love that seeks to control and love that seeks to give freely, between boundaries that protect relationships and boundaries that exclude generosity, between independence that strengthens families and independence that isolates people from the support they don't realize they need. "Mrs. Walsh," one of Sarah's friends said during the cocktail hour, "this is the most incredible wedding reception I've ever attended. How did you manage to create something this spectacular in such a short time?" "When you have the right team and sufficient motivation," I replied, "almost anything becomes possible." "But why did you do all this after... we all noticed you weren't at the ceremony." "I did this because I love my daughter, and I wanted her wedding celebration to be as beautiful as she is." Sometimes the best way to respond to rejection is to demonstrate what the person rejecting you was actually refusing. As the evening progressed, the reactions from guests created the social pressure that made Sarah's position increasingly impossible to maintain. Everyone who attended that reception left understanding exactly what had happened, that a generous, capable mother had been excluded from her daughter's wedding and had responded by creating something so magnificent that it made the exclusion look petty and unreasonable by comparison. "Sarah, your mother is incredible," I heard one guest saying. "I can't believe she created all of this for you." "Mrs. Walsh must love you so much to do something this generous," another guest added. "You're so lucky to have a mother who can create experiences like this. I've never seen anything like this at a family celebration," someone else mentioned. "Your mother has amazing taste and incredible resources." Each comment forced Sarah to confront the gap between how other people saw me and how she had been treating me. Each compliment about my generosity highlighted her own lack of appreciation. Each expression of amazement about what I'd created underscored her failure to recognize my capabilities. But the most devastating moment came during the dinner service, when Isabella's team presented the kind of sophisticated, multi-course meal that guests would normally pay hundreds of dollars to experience at luxury restaurants. "Sarah, this dinner is absolutely incredible," Linda Chen said during the main course. "Your mother has given you a gift that most people could never afford to receive, even for their own weddings." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "I'm starting to understand that I didn't know anything about what my mother was capable of." "Sarah, your mother has spent 6 weeks creating something that professional event planners would consider a career-defining achievement. She did this for you, while you were telling people that her presence at your wedding would be too dramatic and overwhelming." "Linda, I realize I was wrong about everything. The question is, what are you going to do with that realization?" The evening concluded with dancing under string lights that transformed the garden into something that looked like it belonged in fairy tales. The entire celebration had been flawless, every detail perfectly executed, every guest thoroughly impressed, every moment designed to create the kind of memories that people treasure for lifetimes. But more importantly, it had been a demonstration of what becomes possible when someone with real resources and capabilities decides to respond to rejection with generosity rather than resentment. As guests began to leave, many of them approached me to express gratitude for the most beautiful wedding reception they'd ever attended. Several asked for my business card, having realized that the woman who had created this magical evening might be exactly the person they needed for their own special events. But the conversation that mattered most happened as Sarah and David were saying goodbye to the last guests. "Mom," Sarah said, approaching me with tears in her eyes, "I owe you the biggest apology of my life." "Sarah, you don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself some honest reflection about why you convinced yourself that your mother's love was a problem rather than a gift. I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I couldn't see what you were offering me." "Sarah, you couldn't see what I was offering because you needed to believe that you had outgrown your need for your mother's support. You convinced yourself that independence meant rejecting enthusiasm, that boundaries meant excluding generosity, that maturity meant treating love like a burden. How do I fix this? How do I repair what I've done to our relationship? Sarah, You fix this by understanding that the mother you've been rejecting for 5 years is the same person who just gave you the most beautiful night of your life. You fix this by recognizing that love comes in different forms and that rejecting someone's way of showing love doesn't make that love disappear. It just means you miss out on what that love could provide. The wedding that Sarah had planned to protect from my overwhelming presence had become the evening that demonstrated exactly what she'd been protecting herself from: generosity that exceeded expectations, love that created magical experiences, and support that made dreams come true in ways she'd never imagined. 3 years later, Sarah and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and appreciation. She's learned to value my enthusiasm rather than seeing it as pressure, to appreciate my resources rather than treating them as obligations, and to understand that my way of showing love was never about control. It was about creating joy and beauty for the people I care about most. David has become one of my closest allies in the family, someone who understands that having a mother-in-law with resources and connections is a gift rather than a threat, and who makes sure that Sarah never forgets how lucky she is to be loved by someone who can create magic when the occasion calls for it. And I've learned that sometimes the best way to respond to rejection is to demonstrate so clearly what someone is refusing that they can never convince themselves they made the right choice. The daughter who banned me from her wedding because she thought my love was too overwhelming has spent 3 years trying to understand how she could have been so wrong about everything. The woman she dismissed as too dramatic and controlling had created the most generous, beautiful wedding gift she'll ever receive. And the mother she thought she could simply exclude from her special day had taught her a lesson about love, generosity, and consequences that she'll remember for the rest of her life. Today, when people ask Sarah about her wedding, she tells them about 2 celebrations: the intimate ceremony where she married the man she loves, and the spectacular reception where her mother demonstrated what unconditional love looks like when it's given freely and generously. She tells them that the most important thing she learned on her wedding day wasn't about marriage. It was about recognizing the difference between love that seeks to control and love that seeks to create beauty, between boundaries that protect relationships and boundaries that exclude blessings, between independence that strengthens families and independence that isolates people from the very support they need most. The woman who thought she was protecting her wedding from her mother's overwhelming presence had actually been protecting herself from experiencing the most generous gift of her life, and that realization changed everything. At 75 years old, I continue to run my event planning business, creating once-in-a-lifetime experiences for clients who appreciate excellence and understand that some occasions deserve to be celebrated in ways that exceed all expectations. But perhaps more importantly, I've learned that the only limits on our ability to create magic for the people we love are the ones we accept from people who don't understand what we're actually capable of. My daughter wanted to teach me about appropriate boundaries and respectful love. Instead, she learned about the unlimited potential of generosity when it's given by someone who refuses to be underestimated. And that lesson has made all the difference.